Vietnam, 1967. 12 U.S. Marines from the elite Force Recon have been pushing through the jungle for 3 days, pursuing a Viet Cong column. They are certain. They are the hunters. They are the best of the best. The tip of the spear of the world's most powerful army. Now, imagine the look on Sergeant Danny Kowalski's face when he realized the terrifying truth. He wasn't the hunter. He was the bait. A live, loud, conspicuous decoy for the true predators who had been gliding 400 meters away from him for 11 days, and he hadn't even suspected their existence. 5 Australians against 17 Viet Cong, 9 seconds of combat. 0 shots fired toward the Australian positions. The enemy never even knew they were there. How did an abalone diver from Tasmania become the man the Viet Cong called the forest spirit? Why did the Pentagon classify 227 pages of a report on Australian SAS methods? And what did American officers see that made some of them file requests for immediate transfer? In this video is a story you will never be told in official sources. A story of how 300 Australians showed a 500,000-strong American army that it was fighting the wrong way, and why this truth was hidden for 50 years. Watch until the end, and you will learn which Australian methods American Special Forces still use today, pretending they invented them themselves. The 12 men of his patrol had been tracking the Viet Cong supply column for 3 days. They had engaged in firefights twice, called in airstrikes twice, and counted bodies after B-52 raids twice. The standard operating procedure for American reconnaissance units: find, fix, call in air support, repeat. They were loud, they were visible, they drew attention to themselves. That was exactly how Force Recon worked. That was exactly how they were trained. That was exactly how, in their opinion, professionals fought. But here's what Kowalski didn't know, and this changes everything. 400 meters to the east, moving through the very same jungle without disturbing a single leaf or branch, without leaving a single trace on the damp earth, a 5-man Australian SAS team had been silently gliding for 11 days. They were tracking the same Viet Cong column. They were waiting. And the Americans were the bait, and they didn't even suspect it. What happened at dawn forever changed Kowalski's concept of war. When the Viet Cong finally gathered into a strike group to attack the American patrol's position, when they were already crawling up to the perimeter anticipating easy prey, they walked straight into a kill zone the Australians had prepared 3 nights prior. 17 enemy fighters ceased to exist in 9 seconds. Not a single shot was fired toward the Australian positions. Not one. The Viet Cong never found out they were there. They simply vanished, all 17 men, and the Australians dissolved into the jungle as if they had never existed. But this was only the first crack in the American Marines' worldview. Kowalski stood in the middle of the slaughter, looking at bodies scattered in a perfect fan of deadly geometry, and realized everything he knew about war, everything he was taught at Camp Pendleton, everything he believed in was a lie. The most powerful army in the world, with its aircraft carriers, bombers, and billion-dollar budgets, had just been taught a lesson by 5 guys from the other side of the world. In a few minutes, you will learn the methods the Australians used, methods so effective that the Pentagon classified every report on them. The man who planned this operation was Sergeant Colin Hendricks, call sign Blackbird. In a past life, before donning the sand-colored beret with the winged dagger, he was an abalone diver on the coast of Tasmania. His profession taught him to hold his breath for 4 minutes and remain motionless for as long as necessary. In Vietnam, he turned patience into a weapon, one so deadly that captured Viet Cong documents began to feature specific warnings. Avoid the quote, "one" at all costs. And this is where it gets interesting. American Special Forces knew about him. The Green Berets, Mac VSOG, the Navy SEALs, they all heard the stories. They wanted to learn from him, and they were afraid to work next to him. These two feelings, admiration and terror, never existed apart when it came to Australian operators. How did a mollusk diver from a distant southern island become the architect of ambushes that made American commanders question everything they knew about jungle warfare? The answer lies in a story official sources will never tell you. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in 1966. 3 squadrons, each numbering about 100 men. This was negligible compared to the American war machine, which by then already numbered hundreds of thousands of soldiers on Vietnamese soil. The Pentagon treated the Australians' arrival with polite indifference. Just another ally from the Commonwealth, another checkmark on the coalition list, another political favor. But within a year, everything changed. And it changed so drastically that American generals refused to believe their own analysts. The first reports began arriving in the spring of 1967. Analysts at the Pentagon couldn't believe their eyes. The kill ratio of the Australian SAS compared to enemy losses was 1 to 50. 1 to 50. For comparison, the equivalent figure for American special units hovered between 1 to 10 and 1 to 15. The Marine Corps in conventional operations sometimes dropped as low as 1 to 3. These numbers defied all norms. 300 Australians in the bush managed to destroy the enemy with an efficiency that entire American divisions, with their B-52s, Napalm, and Agent Orange, could not achieve. Stay tuned until the end, and you will find out exactly what American observers discovered when they were sent to uncover the Australian secret. Captain Robert McIntyre, a MACV liaison officer, arrived at the Nui Dot base in June 1967 with a specific task: find out how the Australians were doing it. The Pentagon wanted to understand their methods, copy their tactics, and adapt them for American units. Standard procedure for borrowing best practices from allies. But what he discovered over the next 3 months proved so shocking that his reports were immediately classified. The first thing that struck McIntyre was the size of the patrols. Americans went out in groups of 12 to 20 men. Lots of firepower, lots of noise, lots of tracks. The Australians worked in fives. 5 men for 7 to 10 days in the jungle. No support, no extraction, almost no radio communication. 5 shadows entering the green hell and emerging with intelligence worth hundreds of American lives. However, this was just the tip of the iceberg. The second discovery concerned movement methods. American Rangers were taught "Einstride," quote 2, move fast, dominate the terrain, don't give the enemy time to recover. The Australians did the exact opposite. They covered 500 meters a day. 500 meters. Every step calculated, every movement measured, every sound suppressed. They didn't walk through the jungle, they became part of it. And the third thing was something McIntyre refused to write in his official report. The third thing was what kept him awake at night for years after returning home. But more on that in a few minutes. First, you must understand where it all began. The boot ritual. That's how every Australian SAS operation began. Before heading out on patrol, every operator sat down and methodically cut everything superfluous off their footwear. Metal eyelets, gone. Hard inserts in the sole, gone. Anything that could squeak, clink, or crunch with a careless step was ruthlessly removed. The Americans laughed at this. At first, they called the Australian boots quote 3 and cracked jokes about kangaroos. But the laughter stopped after the first joint operation. It turned out that Viet Cong sentries could hear an American patrol from 300 meters away, but they didn't hear the Australians at all. Zero sound. Total silence. As if the jungle simply swallowed these men. But the boots were just the beginning. Just the first layer of the onion the Pentagon had to peel. The Australians carried nothing unnecessary. No tin cans that could rattle. No canteens with chains. No compasses in metal cases. Every piece of gear was wrapped in cloth or tape. Every potentially resonant surface was silenced. Before departure, the patrol commander personally checked each soldier, making him jump in place in full gear. If something made a sound, the patrol did not go out. Period. What you are about to hear explains why the Viet Cong called the Australians forest spirits. Serving within the Australian SAS were men whom the Americans initially mistook for local guides or interpreters. Dark skin, a distinct way of moving, strange rituals before patrols. These were Australian Aboriginals, trackers and hunters whose ancestors had survived in the most inhospitable environment on the planet for 50,000 years. And this is where the story becomes truly incredible. Corporal Jimmy Warren of the Noongar people could determine how many people had walked down a trail by barely visible impressions on rotting leaves. He knew if they were carrying loads, if they carried weapons, if they were tired or fresh. He could tell if they passed an hour ago or 3 days ago. He could smell human sweat from 100 meters away and distinguish the scent of a Vietnamese who ate rice from the scent of a Vietnamese who ate American rations from captured supplies. American trackers, excellent, professional, trained, worked with visible signs, footprints, broken branches, disturbed vegetation. The Aboriginals worked with what was impossible to see. They worked with the jungle itself, as if it were a living being telling them its secrets. Listen to the end, and you will understand why the American command was never able to copy these methods. One of the SAS instructors, Sergeant Major Kevin O'Brien, later described it this way, quote 5, "The Viet Cong gave the Aboriginal trackers their own name. They called them, quote 6, forest ghosts. And this was not poetic exaggeration, it was pure, undiluted fear. But tracking skills were only part of the equation. The darkest part of this story lies ahead. Operation Bach Anny, quote 7. In September 1967 became a turning point. the moment when the American command first realized the magnitude of what they didn't understand about their allies. Intelligence located a large Viet Cong field hospital in Phuoc Tuy province. Estimated strength, up to 200 personnel and patients. The American command proposed a standard solution: airstrikes by B-52 clusters, followed by a Marine battalion landing for cleanup. The Australians refused, and what they did instead went down in history. Instead of 1,000-pound bombs and hundreds of Marines, they sent 2 5-man SAS patrols. 10 men against 200. On paper, it looked like suicide. The patrols spent 11 days in the jungle. For 11 days, they mapped every trail, every sentry post, every changing of the guard. They knew when the cooks started making breakfast and when the officers walked the perimeter. They knew where the wounded slept and where the weapons were stored. They knew everything, and the enemy never found out they were there. The result of the operation stunned even seasoned veterans. On the 12th day, an Australian infantry company, supported by armor, attacked the hospital. The attack lasted 40 minutes. Australian casualties, 0. Enemy losses, 87 men ceased resistance forever. The hospital was destroyed, and 6 months' worth of medical supplies were seized. 0 casualties, in an attack on a fortified position with 200 defenders. The American liaison officers present at the debriefing sat in silence. Then one of them, a major from MACV staff, asked the question hanging in the air. Quote 8. The Australian squadron commander's answer was simple: because you don't have the time. You need results today. We are willing to wait. Patience is also a weapon, perhaps the most important one. But this was just the beginning of the revelations. The Australians' main secret was neither tactics nor patience. American doctrine in Vietnam was built on 3 pillars: firepower, mobility, and metrics. Generals in Saigon and Washington demanded numbers. The number of enemies killed, the famous 10, became the main measure of success. The more bodies, the better the war is going. The more bombs dropped, the closer the victory. The Australians viewed this with horror. Their philosophy was the complete opposite. They didn't count bodies. They counted information. Each SAS patrol went out not to destroy, but to learn. Where are the enemy bases? Which trails are they using? How is their logistics organized? Who are their commanders? What are they planning? One Australian officer, Captain Barry Peterson, who commanded a unit of Montagnard Hill tribesmen, later formulated it like this: Americans measured success by the number of dead Vietnamese. We measured success by the number of live Australians. That's the whole difference in philosophy. And now we come to what Captain McIntyre refused to write in his reports, to the methods the Pentagon classified, to the reason why some American officers, after joint operations with the Australians, filed transfer requests. What you are about to hear never made it into official reports. Psychological warfare is a term that sounds sterile and academic. It evokes associations with leaflets, radio broadcasts, and propaganda posters. What the Australian SAS practiced in Phuoc Tuy province had nothing to do with this textbook definition. They didn't try to convince the enemy to surrender. They wanted the enemy to be afraid. Afraid enough to refuse to go on patrols. Afraid enough to desert in entire platoons. Afraid enough to tell stories that spread through the Viet Cong faster than any radio broadcast. The details of exactly how they did this remain a subject of debate in classified documents to this day, but some facts leaked through the veil of secrecy. Enemy bodies left in specific poses, tracks pointing in specific directions, objects appearing in Viet Cong camps even though the perimeter was never breached, symbols carved into trees, notes in Vietnamese found in the pockets of dead comrades. One intercepted Viet Cong document, dated December 1967, contained an instruction for unit commanders, spirits of the forest, Ma Rung, a dark myth, created consciously and methodically. This is why American psychological operations failed. They dropped millions of leaflets promising rewards for surrender. The Australians created nightmares that were passed from mouth to mouth around the evening fires of Viet Cong camps. And it worked. The numbers don't lie. By 1968, in Phuoc Tuy province, where the Australian SAS operated, there were 40% fewer attacks on convoys recorded than in neighboring provinces with an American presence. Guerrilla cells suffered a chronic shortage of recruits. Locals were afraid to join the Viet Cong because it meant going to war with ghosts. But every coin has 2 sides, and here the story becomes truly uncomfortable for the Pentagon. The American military command faced a dilemma. On one hand, Australian methods worked. They worked phenomenally, in ways nothing in the Pentagon's arsenal did. On the other hand, to officially acknowledge these methods, to officially recommend them for American units, would mean admitting to things that didn't fit the public image of a liberation mission. What did the Pentagon choose? It chose secrecy. It classified the reports and pretended it saw nothing. Captain McIntyre's reports were stamped, quote, 14, quote. The results of the comparative analysis of American and Australian unit effectiveness were never published. The official history of the Vietnam War mentions the Australian contingent with a meager line in a footnote. But in narrow circles, among those who knew, the conversations continued, and here is what they discussed. Sergeant Danny Kowalski, the very Marine whose patrol was used as bait that October night, spent another 3 months in Phuoc Tuy province. During that time, he observed Australian patrol actions twice, from a distance because they wouldn't let him get any closer. Later, in an interview for an oral history of Vietnam veterans recorded in 1993, he told of what he saw. His words were not included in the official publication. Too uncomfortable. Too contradictory to the narrative. But a copy of the transcript survived in the archives. And here's what was written there. Kowalski said, "We thought we were the best. Force Recon, the elite of the Marine Corps, the tip of the spear. And then you watch 5 Australians do what 20 of our guys couldn't do, and do it without a single shot, without a single sound, without a single trace. And you realize that everything you were taught is how to pound with a hammer where a scalpel is needed." He paused and added words that explain everything. But the strangest thing wasn't that. The strangest thing was that after their operations, the local Vietnamese looked at us differently. Not at the Australians, at us, Americans. Before, there was fear or hatred in their eyes. But then something new appeared. Disdain, maybe. As if they realized that we were louder, but not scarier. But that wasn't the most uncomfortable revelation. The story continues, and it gets even more interesting. In the summer of 1968, when the Tet Offensive upturned American perceptions of the war's progress, a group of senior MACV officers initiated a secret project codenamed Southern Cross. The goal of the project, the systematic study of Australian tactics for possible adaptation into American Special Forces. A team of analysts spent 3 months at Nui Dat. They studied everything, from personnel selection methods to patrol food rations. They interviewed Australian operators, watched training, and analyzed documentation on past operations. Their final report was 243 pages long. Of those, 16 reached American commanders. The remaining 227 were classified. What was in those 227 pages? You are about to find out. Fragmentary information allows us to piece together a partial picture. First, Australian selection for the SAS weeded out 90% of candidates. American Special Operations units couldn't afford such a luxury. Too much war, too few people. Quality had to be traded for quantity. Second, Australian training lasted significantly longer than American training. Before getting to Vietnam, an SAS operator went through a multi-month cycle of training, including survival in the Australian bush, one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. The American system couldn't reproduce this experience. Third, and this was key, Australian tactics required patience, strategic, operational, and tactical patience at all levels. And patience was the last thing the American command could afford under pressure from Washington, the press, and public opinion. The war the Australians fought was incompatible with the war the Americans were forced to fight. Not because the methods couldn't be copied, they could. Not because men couldn't be trained, they could. But because the political, media, and bureaucratic structure of American involvement in the war made such an approach impossible. Generals needed results by the end of the quarter. Australian tactics required time measured in years. So the Pentagon chose what it could, to close its eyes. But the story didn't end there. It was only beginning. The fact is, among the American officers who saw the Australians in action, there were men with good memories and long careers. Men who, 10, 15, 20 years later, found themselves in positions to influence doctrine. And here's what they did with that knowledge. When a massive review of the American Special Operations concept began in the early 80s, when the United States Special Operations Command was being created, when new textbooks were being written and new training programs developed, among the authors of these documents were Vietnam veterans who remembered. They couldn't cite classified reports. They couldn't officially reference the Australian experience, but they could, and did, implement ideas, concepts, and approaches that suspiciously resembled what the guys from Nui Dat practiced 20 years prior. An emphasis on reconnaissance instead of firepower, small teams instead of large units, patience as a tactical advantage, psychological impact as a weapon no less important than the physical, Modern American Special Forces, Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, JSOC units use methods that are strangely similar to what the Australian SAS did in Phuoc Tuy Province half a century ago. Of course, officially, no one admits this. Officially, American doctrine developed independently based on its own experience and research. But those who know history see the connections. Connections that will never make it into textbooks. And now, let's return to the man with whom it all began, Sergeant Colin Hendricks, the abalone diver who turned patience into an art form. After returning from Vietnam in 1969, he continued serving in the SAS for another 12 years. He trained a new generation of operators. He participated in operations that still cannot be spoken of. He reached the rank of Warrant Officer Class 1, the highest rank for a man who started his career as a private. After retiring, he returned to Tasmania. He began diving for abalone again, as if 30 years of war were just a long break. In the year 2000, the Australian government declassified some documents regarding SAS operations in Vietnam. Journalists rushed to find veterans for interviews. Hendricks refused them all. The only thing he told a reporter who managed to reach him by phone was, "Some things should stay in the jungle. That's where they belong." He passed away in 2011 at the age of 73. He was buried in a small cemetery in a fishing village on the southern coast of Tasmania, overlooking the very ocean he dove into before the war and after it. There is no mention of military service on his tombstone, only his name and dates. That was his wish, but the story of those who saw continues, and here is how it ended for each of them. Sergeant Kowalski was discharged in 1970. He didn't participate in anti-war protests, didn't write memoirs, didn't give loud interviews. He returned to his native Chicago, got a job at the post office, worked there for 32 years, and retired. When asked if what he saw that October night changed his attitude toward war, he replied, quote, 19. Captain McIntyre went further. After Vietnam, he stayed in the Army, was promoted to colonel, and commanded units in Germany and Korea. In the mid-80s, he worked for a time in the Pentagon, in the Special Operations Planning Division. His name does not appear in the official history of the reform of American Special Forces, but several people who worked with him in those years later recounted that he constantly referred to the quote 20 in discussions about new doctrine. And now, the final part of this story, what happened 30 years after Vietnam, when in 1991, during Desert Storm, American Special Forces demonstrated capabilities no one suspected they had. The ability to operate deep behind enemy lines in small groups for weeks, gathering intelligence and guiding precision strikes. Somewhere on the southern coast of Tasmania, an old abalone diver might have allowed himself a faint smile. The circle had closed. The students had finally grown to match the teachers, although officially, of course, there never were any teachers. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment left Vietnam in 1971. In 5 years of combat operations, they lost 2 men, 2 out of roughly 500 who passed through the Vietnam rotation. For comparison, American losses during the same period amounted to more than 50,000 men. Of course, the comparison is unfair. The scales of presence are incomparable. The missions differed. Statistics do not account for context. But here's a context it does account for. In Phuoc Tuy Province, where the Australians operated, the guerrilla movement was almost completely suppressed by the time they left. Not destroyed, suppressed. Local Viet Cong cells were afraid to go out on operations. The population, which previously supported the partisans, began cooperating with government forces. After the Australians left, everything returned to square one. Within a year and a half, the province was guerrilla territory again, as if nothing had happened, because the thing that produced results was gone. There was no patience, no trackers, no quote 21 quote, no forest ghosts. There were bombs, helicopters, body counts, and the road home. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. America lost. Australia formally lost too, although their participation in the big picture was so minor that few remembered it. But the lessons remained. Classified, unacknowledged, unofficial, but learned by those who wanted to learn. And when, 30 years later, American Special Forces began hunting al-Qaeda leaders in the mountains of Afghanistan, when they demonstrated patience no one expected from them, when they sat in ambushes for weeks and gathered intelligence for months instead of bombing everything in sight, that was an echo of lessons learned half a century ago in the green hell of Phuoc Tuy Province. Officially, of course, this never happened. Officially, the Americans learned everything themselves. Official history is like that. Convenient. But the jungle remembers. The jungle always remembers. And somewhere in the Pentagon archives, 227 pages of Project Ja, quote, 22 still gather dust. Pages that officially never existed, about methods officially never applied, written by men who officially saw nothing. Sergeant Kowalski passed away in 2019. Colonel McIntyre in 2015. Corporal Jimmy Warren, the Aboriginal tracker whose name the Viet Cong whispered, in 2003. One by one, the witnesses are leaving, and with them go the stories that never made it into the textbooks. But some stories are more stubborn than people. Some stories find a way to survive. That is how this story ended up in front of you today. Not from official archives, not from military history textbooks, not from command-approved memoirs, from fragments, from slips of the tongue, from what leaked through decades of secrecy, from the memories of men who were there and didn't forget, the Marine from Chicago who realized he was bait, the diver from Tasmania who taught the jungle to fear, the tracker from the Noongar people who read the earth like an open book. They didn't make it into Hollywood movies. Aircraft carriers and bases aren't named after them. Their feats aren't taught in academies, but they changed history. Quietly, unnoticed, just like everything else they did. Like ghosts in the jungle who appear, do their work, and dissolve into the green gloom. Ma Rung, forest spirits. They are gone, but their shadows still fall on those who wear the sand-colored beret with the winged dagger, and on those who, without even knowing it, use methods invented half a century ago by men who officially never existed. If you like this video, like and subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories ahead about Australia's shadow wars that never made it into the textbooks. That is the real story, not the one in the books. The real one is always uncomfortable. That's why they hide it, but it finds a way to come to light. It always finds a way.